Hello, this is the introductory video for Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales, which is the bulk of the reading material for this week. Fortunately, I don't need to go into great detail regarding Chaucer, his biography, or even some of the background of the Canterbury Tales because you're going to be watching a lecture on Middle English literature by Dr. Walker Eden. You're also assigned to read the introduction in our copy of the Canterbury Tales, which is not terribly long. In fact, it's rather short, but it does give you a little capsule biography of his life. He is a 14th century author, 1342 or so to 1400. I think I need to justify why we are spending so much time on Chaucer. We're spending almost, 1/8 of the course on this person. So what's the big deal? Well, as Dr. Walker Eden explains in her lecture, Chaucer is sometimes considered the father of the English language. Not because he invented English or something silly like that, but because of the permanent mark that he leaves on the English language. Now, he was writing in what is called Middle English, which means that what you are reading is a translation. Even though the original's in English, it's in a form of English that you could probably plow through very, very slowly on your own, but it would be pretty challenging. So we're reading this translation. So note already that here's one of a number of parallels between Chaucer and Dante. Chaucer makes the decision to write in the vernacular. Even though he was perfectly capable of writing in Latin, he wanted his great masterwork, the Canterbury Tales, to be written in the common language of the English people. So there's certainly a trend in the late Middle Ages toward the vernacular. Again, historical context, I don't think I need to say very much because of Dr. Walker Eden's lecture and the introduction in the book. I will just point out that even though both he and Dante are late medieval figures, he actually comes quite a bit later than Dante. He's born a couple of decades after Dante dies, and it means that in many ways, not in all ways, but in many ways, he lived in a different world. So for instance, unlike Dante, Chaucer lives through the Black Death as a young boy. He lives through the Great Schism and the peasant revolts. He is not only lives through the 100 Years' War, but he was actually involved in that war and was a prisoner of war for a certain time during that conflict. So, yes, he's late medieval, like Dante, but they are different generations, and that makes a difference. So he starts writing the Canterbury Tales. He wrote a number of other things too, but he starts writing the Canterbury Tales relatively late in his life, around 1380 or so. So let me go back to this question just for a moment of what the big deal is about Chaucer and why we're spending so much time on him. It's not simply that he left a permanent mark on the English language. There are other things, too, that he's bringing to the table. One of his greatest gifts, and you'll see this, I think, most evidently in the general prologue, but he has the ability in just a few short strokes to create an entire world populated by vivid, unforgettable characters. So he's able to kind of give you the essence of somebody just by choosing precise, significant details. And we'll run through one example of that in just a bit. The other thing he's able to do is take on voices of people who are wildly different from one another. So he's not just describing people. That's what he does in the general prologue. But in the prologues of the tales and in the tales themselves, he's taking on voices of people from all over the social and moral spectrum. And he does it so effectively. So if we were to compare him to an actor, he's much more Daniel Day-Lewis than Ben Affleck, right? Ben Affleck is basically a version of Ben Affleck in every movie. Daniel Day-Lewis so completely inhabits each role that at a certain point you really forget that you're watching an actor, you forget that you're watching this guy named Daniel Day-Lewis, and you just believe he is the character. So, see Lincoln if you don't know what I'm talking about. Chaucer's like that. Chaucer is so good at speaking in so many different voices, and he does it so convincingly. That is a big part of the appeal. And finally, I'll just add, and there's all sorts of other things I could add. The only other thing I will add is that there is great historical value in this work as well, because what he's doing is he's painting a kind of group portrait of English society in the late Middle Ages as it is undergoing some pretty rapid and significant changes. One of the big changes that's happening is the rise of the urban middle class, and that is the group that is really on display in the Canterbury Tales. So these are primarily, although not exclusively, city folk that we're dealing with. All right, so the premise of the Canterbury Tales, if you don't know this already, is that you've got a group of pilgrims, people who are preparing to go on pilgrimage. Fortunately, you have a lecture from Dr. Farmer this week on pilgrimage and penance, and I'll talk about penance in another video. So you learn from that lecture what pilgrimage is all about. By definition, a pilgrimage is a journey undertaken for some sort of religious purpose. But one of the things that you realize very quickly, reading the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales, is that in reality, pilgrimages were not always pious, spiritual journeys that people took for, devout reasons. No, pilgrimages were also sort of vacations. They were a good excuse to take a trip. So you have to assume, and I think you can see clearly in the general prologue, there's a variety of motives for why these pilgrims are going on this trip. Now, why is it that they're going to Canterbury? Canterbury is not in itself a terribly significant English city. Even today, most tourists who go to England will never go to Canterbury. Well, why are all these people going to Canterbury? Well, you have to go back a couple hundred years before the time of Chaucer. Go back to the 12th century. Henry II was the king, and he wanted to appoint an Archbishop of Canterbury, which is to this day the highest position in the Church of England. He wanted to appoint an Archbishop of Canterbury who would basically be a yes man, who would allow Henry to handle the church however he wanted. So he appoints his drinking buddy, Thomas Becket, B-E-C-K-E-T. Well, that was a sensible plan for Henry. The problem is, once Thomas Becket becomes Archbishop of Canterbury, he kind of gets religion and starts taking his role seriously and puts up resistance anytime that Henry tries to impose his will on the church. And things get to such a point of tension that essentially Henry II calls a hit on Thomas Becket, and he is murdered, not personally by Henry II, but by some of his henchmen. He is murdered in the cathedral in Canterbury in 1170. And almost instantly, Becket is seen by the English people as a martyr. He is buried there in Canterbury, and again, almost overnight, his tomb becomes a magnet for pilgrims. So that's kind of the story behind it. So by the time of the Canterbury Tales, people have been visiting the shrine of Thomas Becket for a couple hundred years. So the premise is that all these pilgrims who are about to go on pilgrimage are holed up at an inn in London called the Tabard, And the innkeeper comes up with this plan. Look, we've got to take this trip to Canterbury. How are we going to while away the time? Let's have everybody tell stories. 2 stories going, 2 stories coming back, and there's a prize for whoever is the best storyteller. Now, it's not quite clear if Chaucer ever really planned on having that many stories. But one thing is for sure, and that is, as we have it today, that's not actually, that doesn't match with the Canterbury Tales that we have, in which people basically tell one story. Okay. What I want to do in the remainder of this video is talk about the general prologue, to give you some pointers on how to read the general prologue, and then give you one concrete example of how to approach these character sketches that we get in the general prologue. The trick in the general prologue is trying to figure out what the narrator, who is Chaucer himself, what the narrator really thinks and wants us to think about each of these characters. Okay. Very rarely will Chaucer just say, wow, this guy's just great. He is a stand-up guy, or this person is a moral disgrace. Very rarely will he come out and say anything that bluntly, and as I'll say in a moment, even when he does, you have to be a little cautious. So because he rarely just tells you what to think about the characters, you have to pick up on the significant details that Chaucer gives us. They tend to be very precise details, and they might seem to be just superficial details. He'll describe the physical features of one of the pilgrims' faces. He'll describe their clothing. He'll describe their horse and what their horses look like. He'll also talk about who is traveling with whom. And I think he is basically assuming that birds of a feather flock together. So you have to look for all of these things. And above all, and this is the point I wanted to get to, or I mentioned a moment ago, above all, you have to be on the alert for irony. Chaucer loves irony. Irony, simply put, is saying one thing, meaning another. Okay? So sarcasm is one form of irony. So why don't I want to spend the rest of the video really just looking at one particular pilgrim and how Chaucer describes that pilgrim in the general prologue, to kind of give you a template for how to read the rest of the general prologue. And the character that I've selected is the monk. So make sure you have your book out. Pause if you need be and get your book. This is, in my edition, and I hope your edition too, starting on page 7. If you have a different edition, this is a few pages into the general prologue. So the monk is not the first character that has been described. But I think you can see a lot of Chaucer's tricks on display here. So I wanted to choose it. And I also wanted to choose it because he is a religious figure. And as I'll say in another video, Chaucer has a lot to say about the church of his time. And so that's something you'll definitely want to be reading for. Okay, so I'm going to read this, and I'll pause occasionally to gloss what Chaucer has just said. So this is about 2/3 of the way down on page 7. A monk there was, one of the finest sort who rode the country. Now see, right there, you have to be careful. You might say, oh, well, he's one of the finest monks who rode the country. So Chaucer, the narrator, is going to be really has a positive attitude toward this guy. Maybe, maybe not. We have to read on to find out. Hunting was his sport. A manly man, to be an abbot, able. Abbot is the chief of a monastery. Many a dainty horse he had in stable. His bridle when he rode, a man might hear jingling in a whistling wind, as clear, aye, and as loud as does the chapel bell, where my Lord Monk was prior of the cell. Prior is sort of a vice abbot kind of figure. So this is somebody in a position of authority in a monastery. The rule of good Saint Bennet, or Saint Maur. Bennet is short for Benedict, who wrote the most famous monastic rule of all time. Saint Maur was a disciple of Benedict. The rule of good Saint Bennet, or Saint Maur, as old and strict, he tended to ignore. That should give you pause, okay? Now, we've been told at the very beginning he's one of the finest monks, one of the finest sort who rode the country, but now we're told he basically ignores the monastic rules that presumably his community uses. He let go by the things of yesterday and took the modern world's more spacious way. Now again, maybe this isn't a criticism. Maybe he's saying, you know, this monk realized that the old monastic ways weren't going to cut it in this time, this modern time, and that's okay. So we still have to read on to really figure out what the attitude is here. He did not rate that text at a plucked hen, which says that hunters are not holy men. That may be a reference to the story about Esau, right? Esau was a hunter, but of course was supplanted by his brother Jacob. So possibly a reference to that text in Genesis. And this is the top of page 8. And then a monk uncloistered is a mere fish out of water flapping on the pier. That is to say, a monk out of his cloister. Cloister is basically a synonym for the monastery itself. And according to, say, the rule of St. Benedict, monks were supposed to stay on the monastery grounds unless it was absolutely necessary for him to leave. We're being told by Chaucer that this monk doesn't have that mentality at all. He is frequently absent from the monastery. That was a text he held not worth an oyster, and I agreed and said his views were sound. Now again, the narrator is saying, I agreed, his views are sound. So if you're reading this very superficially, you're saying, okay, well, Chaucer really likes this guy. He thinks this guy is a good monk, a model monk. But you have to read on. Was he to study till his head went round, poring over books and cloisters? Must he toil as Austin, that's a contraction for Augustine, must he toil as Austin bade and till the very soil? Must he really do manual labor? I mean, come on, give me a break. Was he to leave the world upon the shelf? Let Austin have his labor to himself. So again, we're not quite sure. Is this irony? Is the narrator being sincere? What's going on here? We have to continue. This monk was therefore a good man to horse. Greyhounds he had, as swift as birds, to course. To course means to pursue game. Hunting a hare or riding at a fence was all his fun. He spared for no expense. I saw his sleeves were garnished at the hand with fine gray fur, the finest in the land. And on his hood, to fasten it at his chin, he had a wrought gold, cunningly fashioned pin. Into a lover's knot it seemed to pass. His head was bald and shone like looking glass. So did his face, as if it had been greased. He was a fat and personable priest. His prominent eyeballs never seemed to settle. They glittered like the flames beneath the kettle. Supple his boots, his horse in fine condition. He was a prelate fit for exhibition. He was not pale like a tormented soul. He liked a fat swan best, and roasted whole. His palfrey, his riding horse, was as brown as is a berry. I think that last paragraph that I just read, that really tips Chaucer's hand. If you really thought that maybe Chaucer thought that this was that he was a great monk, I think you're going to be disabused of that in this last paragraph. Because what are we told in this last paragraph? We're told about the way he dresses. Now, of course, dressing is literally kind of a superficial thing. But for Chaucer, dress can be a window into the soul. And he loves luxury, right? He's got the finest fur. He eats sort of gourmet food, a fat swan roasted whole. He spares for no expense. I mean, think about it. Monks are supposed to take, well, they had to take, in order to be a monk, a vow of poverty, which meant that they agreed that they would only take what was needed for survival, basically, and shun all luxury and excess. Well, clearly, that is the opposite of what this monk is doing. And then we get a description of his face. Again, for Chaucer, the face is a window into the soul. That's not to say that Chaucer believed that was true in real life, but it's certainly true in his fiction. We're told that he's fat. His prominent eyeballs, we've got bulging eyeballs, never seem to settle. So his eyes are always kind of shifting about. He's shifty, right? His face looks like it's been greased. Okay, this is never a compliment, right? So we are told, I think, in no uncertain terms, that this is actually not a model monk at all. In fact, he is a mockery of the monastic profession. But see, you have to be willing to look out for irony. So when we go back to earlier sections where he says things like, I agreed with him and said his views were sound, that is irony. It's not always going to be irony. You're going to have to figure it out by looking at those details and making your judgment accordingly. So that's what you're going to have to do as you read about these characters. Also notice his companion. He seems to be riding right along with the friar. And when you read about the friar, you will see that Chaucer also thinks that he is a pretty sorry excuse for a friar. And so the very fact that the monk is linked with the friar, of course, reflects very badly on the monk. Well, as I said, there'll be another lecture on Chaucer as a critic of the church, so we'll come back to this. Let me say this in closing. Hopefully you've already looked at your essay question for the week. I want you to do that every week. You've got an essay question, and even the weeks you have a discussion forum. Look and see what the essay question is so that you can be sort of thinking that through as you watch these videos, as you read the assignments, and so on. Now, in this particular case, the essay is about Chaucer's views on love and marriage. You're reading 4 tales in the Canterbury Tales. 3 of them touch on matters having to do with love and marriage. I want to say that for this particular essay question, you are basically on your own. I think you can do this on your own. And I want you to read these stories carefully and try to articulate what the views toward love and marriage, what views are being presented by these different pilgrims. And the views are going to be very different in some cases. And then I say that in your concluding paragraph, I want you to speculate a bit, because that's all you can do, speculate on the views that Chaucer himself might seem to gravitate toward, if any. Right? It may be that you conclude that Chaucer doesn't think that any of these perspectives on love or marriage are particularly sound. But I want you to try to address that question. So you're going to have to read these tales carefully. You're going to have to use a dictionary, because even though, yes, we're reading a modern English translation, it's a modern English translation produced by an Englishman in the middle of the 20th century, and he uses a lot of words that we do not use in our day-to-day discourse. So I'm not saying you absolutely have to look up every single unfamiliar word, but sometimes one word makes a huge difference. So be prepared to look up words in the dictionary. And I also want to point you to another resource as well. Every once in a while, when you read, you'll see there's an asterisk at the end of a line. That means there is a note about it at the end. So make use of these notes at the end of the book as well. All right, well, the next video will address Chaucer and his attitudes toward the church of his day.